Hello, my name is Franz Massard Vargas, Salesforce Security Analyst, and I appreciate you taking the time to come to my presentation today regarding Salesforce's 2007 data breach. We'll be taking this as a case study, wherein we'll be analyzing Salesforce's data breach to identify ways in which we, software as a service providers, can learn from what occurred, can identify ways that we might be able to improve internally, and identify appropriate responses to attacks that occur in the future. We'll begin with an overview of Salesforce. Salesforce is a customer relationship management software. So Salesforce functions in that it is a software as a service that allows different organizations across the world to manage their contacts, accounts, and times that they've interacted with different employees. Salesforce is very flexible in that it can also be used for contract management, so being able to identify who is contracting with who, what business your organization is doing inside and outside of the country, as well as being able to be manipulated and applied to a variety of different business functions. The first we heard from Salesforce of the data breach was in November of 2007, when Salesforce acknowledged that company information for some of their clients had been stolen. This information was stolen because a Salesforce employee had incorrectly clicked through a phishing email and provided administrator credentials that allowed attackers to access company data stored within Salesforce's servers. This breach led to thousands of customers having their organizations compromised. On the board behind me, you'll see how Salesforce connects to a variety of customer organizations. But the challenge with this breach is that it gets bigger. The net continues to grow as each of these customer organizations had dozens of different accounts, contacts, and information about organizations they do business with that was then compromised by this attack. eWeek reported that the phishing attempt hit a broad range of customers and then was used for an effective spear phishing attempt, wherein attackers target the phishing attempts with information that is relevant to that company, making them far more believable and far more effective. One particular example reported by the Washington Post was a spear phishing attack in which attackers posed as the Federal Trade Commission, targeting over 500 different accounts and infecting many devices with tools like keyloggers and viruses that cause challenges for those impacted customers. Let's begin with analysis on the cause and impacts from the breach. In terms of the cause, there's a simple answer and a more indirect answer. The simple answer is that a Salesforce employee provided credentials to attackers who were then able to compromise the system. But how do we, as software as a service providers, make it so that this is less likely to happen? There are 4 appropriate responses that we can take. We can begin with employee training. This is critical, especially for service providers, that we train our staff on how to appropriately respond, identify, and notify in events of phishing and malicious attacks. This can include example phishing emails, walking through key critical steps to take, such as never sharing credentials, reporting suspicious emails, or when in doubt, contacting the person on the other end through another method of communication such as phone to verify their identity. The second approach that we can take, specifically as security experts, is working on inbound email management. We can set up routing rules that prevent the majority of this malicious attack and malicious content from getting to our end users by building out ways that we can identify keywords or key concepts that are used for malicious attacks, or whitelisting and blacklisting certain domains. We can dramatically reduce our risk simply by dramatically reducing the volume seen. Thirdly is multi-factor authentication. The concept of multi-factor authentication is that in order for a user to log into a system, they need more than simply a username and password. This could include biometric authentication, tokens or physical devices that generate information needed for login, or connections through a mobile device or other tool. Multi-factor authentication can easily be paired with a variety of other methods to make logins secure. These can include specifying IP ranges in which your users can log in from. This would prevent attacks similar to what happened to Salesforce if they had identified the IP ranges used by their company. Additionally, identify network restrictions, such that users cannot access your tool when they are on an unsecured wireless network. I'd next like to discuss the concept of least privilege. Least privilege has to do with why this breach spread so quickly. The concept of least privilege is that any user should only have access to be able to take action on what they need to take action on for their day-to-day and work. Now, in this instance, the employee that was compromised had access to far more than he needed. His credentials were able to be used to impact a variety of different customers across Salesforce. If, in this example, he had least privilege and was only able to access the 2 or 3 customers he was actively working with, this would be a different story. The breach would have been significantly less and significantly easier to contain. We'll now move on to how this response could have been handled better. Now, you'll note that when I described the attack, I noted that Salesforce released information in November of 2007. That being said, there were reports of increased phishing attacks for 3 to 4 months prior to this notification. And while Salesforce has not disclosed how early they found out about the phishing attack, we can realistically assume that they knew for a few weeks before disclosing to the public, simply due to the number of reports that customers sent to their organization. This response was thus slow to disclose, and Plixer, an article cited in this presentation, notes that there was no report to the SEC, identifying this as an official data breach. Salesforce also did not reveal which specific organizations had been targeted and what the extent of this data breach was. This made it very difficult for companies to be able to respond, as they were unsure if they were actually impacted by this notification from Salesforce or not. So what can we learn from this event? We can learn that it is better to be proactive in our user training over being reactive. Salesforce, in the months following the breach, dramatically stepped up their efforts to train employees on how to identify phishing attacks, how to improve their own individual end-user security, and building out tools that we've discussed today, like multi-factor authentication and login IP ranges. It helps to be able to encourage this type of behavior from our customers. As each of us represents a different software as a service, we need to advocate for the security of our customers and advocate for the use of the tools we provide them. Keep this in mind as you're working with your end users, implementing new systems, that the security of their system reflects on the security of ours. We can also learn that software as a service and large providers of services need to consider security paramount. This needs to be one of the high priorities as we go into this next decade. We must consider that our organizations rely on us for the security of their information. They are trusting us to be able to protect that information from outside attack. We need to make sure that our firewalls are to the top of the line, that our end users are trained on how to protect this information, and that there's multiple levels of authentication that users must go through to be able to impact this authentication. We also learned that no organizations are immune to phishing attacks. Salesforce is often considered to be an industry leader, yet a Salesforce employee was attacked by a phishing attempt and led to compromising of dozens and dozens of different locations and different pieces of information. InfoSec notes that if we don't invest in our employees and in training on protecting from malicious attacks, we too will become victims. It's inevitable. This is a necessity for software as a service providers to take. We also learned that the risk of provider attacks becomes less common as more users work from home. What does this mean? Well, Pixlr cites that this is because it becomes easier to compromise a home device over attacking, let's say, Salesforce's servers. So as we move into the next decade, we need to consider that more and more of our users are going to be working remote. From bring your own device policies to local computers at their library or other public institution. And we also need to build our security approach such that we will not end up allowing those end-user devices to be compromised. We can do much to protect our own servers, but we need to keep in mind that our end users also need protection on their end as well. In closing, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this brief case study where we discussed Salesforce's data breach and some of the ways that the breach could have been prevented, responded to more appropriately, and what we've learned. The 4 key takeaways that I'd like you to take from this presentation are the ways in which this attack could have been prevented. Employee training is critical. Being able to have an employee base that knows how attacks come into the organization, how to identify those attacks, and how to report those attacks incredibly increases your security. We also discussed inbound message filtering and how we as security professionals can make it easier for the staff that work at our company to be able to prevent attacks such as phishing that occurred at Salesforce. We reviewed multi-factor authentication, which walks through how multiple ways of authenticating into a system might be required. This is one way that could have prevented an attacker that had simply a set of credentials from accessing thousands of different customers' data. And lastly, we discussed the concept of least privilege, which I heartily recommend taking as a follow-up to go back to your organization and identify that least privilege is in place.